Traditions and Encounters, Chapter 16, from pages 289 to 305. Christian Western Europe during the Middle Ages, Chapter 16. Eyewitness. I'll try and get as close as I can. From Venice to China and back. In 1260 CE, two brothers, Niccolo and Maffeo Polo, traveled from their native Venice to Constantinople. The Polo brothers were jeweled merchants, and while in Constantinople, they decided to pursue opportunities farther east. They went first to trading cities on the Black Sea and the Volga River, and then spent 3 years in the great Central Asian trading city of Bokhara. While in Bokhara, they received an invitation to join diplomatic embassy going to the court of the Kublai Khan. They readily agreed and traveled by caravan to the Mongol court, where the Great Khan received them and inquired about their land, rulers, and religion. Kublai was especially interested in learning more about Roman Catholic Christianity. Thus, he asked the Polo brothers to return to Europe and request the Pope to send learned theologians who could serve as the authoritative sources of information on Christian doctrine. They accepted the mission and returned to Italy in 1269 as envoys of the Great Khan. The Polo brothers were not able to satisfy the Great Khan's desire for expertise in Christian doctrine. The Pope designated 2 missionaries to accompany the Polos, and the party set out in 1271. Together with the Niccolo's 17-year-old son Marco Polo. Soon, however, the missionaries became alarmed at fighting along the route, and they decided to abandon the embassy and return to Europe. Only the Polos completed the journey, arriving at the Mongol court in Chengdu in 1274. Although they presented Kublai with presents and letters from the Pope rather than the requested missionaries, the Great Khan received them warmly. In fact, they remained in China in the service of the Great Khan for the next 17 years. Their mission gave rise to Marco Polo's celebrated account of his travels, and it signaled the reintegration of Europe into the political and economic affairs of the larger Eastern Hemisphere. During the early Middle Ages, from about 500 to 1000 CE, Western Europe was a violent and disorderly land. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire and invasions by migratory peoples wrecked European society and the economy. The Germanic Carolingian Empire, ruled most famously by Charlemagne, provided order in much of Europe only for a short time before internal political division and a new series of invasions led to its demise in 843 CE. As a result of the turmoil and disarray that plagued Europe during the half millennium from 500 to 1000 CE, Western Europeans played little role in the development of the hemispheric economy during the era dominated by the Song, Abbasid, and Byzantine empires. However, Europeans did begin to lay the foundations of a more dynamic society in the early Middle Ages. For example, regional states began to provide a stable political order. New tools and techniques led to increased agricultural production and economic growth. In addition, the Western Christian Church brought cultural and religious unity to most of Europe. Based on such political, economic, and cultural foundations, Europeans were able to build a vibrant and powerful society. From about 1000 to 1300 CE, the period known in Europe as the High Middle Ages, although the idea of empire continued to fascinate European leaders, no one managed to bring all of Europe under their control during the High Middle Ages. Instead, local rulers organized powerful regional states Increased agricultural production fueled rapid population growth. Economic expansion led to increased long-distance trade in rich cities and helped to create new towns. Political organization, demographic increase, and economic growth pushed Europeans once again into the larger world. European merchants began to participate directly in the commercial economy of the Eastern Hemisphere, sometimes traveling as far as China in such search of luxury goods. Ambitious military and political leaders expanded the boundaries of Christianity by seizing Muslim-held territories in Spain and the Mediterranean islands. European forces even mounted a series of military crusades that sought to recapture Palestine and the city of Jerusalem from Muslim control. Those efforts clearly demonstrated that Europeans were beginning to play a much larger role in the world than they had for the previous half millennium. Here's the chronology. Sorry. The quest for order and the establishment of regional states. Long after its collapse in the late 5th century CE, the Roman Empire inspired European leaders who dreamed of a centralized political structure embracing all of Christian Europe. Yet it was not until the late 8th and 9th centuries that a Germanic group, the Franks, temporarily re-established imperial authority in Western Europe. Even then, imperial authority was short-lived and collapsed by the late 9th century. In the late 10th century, a new attempt was made by German princes who formed the Holy Roman Empire, which they viewed as a Christian revival of the earlier Roman Empire. In fact, however, the Roman Empire returned only in name. All attempts to extend its influence beyond Germany met stiff resistance from the popes and from the princes of other European lands. Medieval Europe became a political mosaic of independent and competing regional states. Independent monarchies emerged in France and England, and other authorities ruled the various regions of Italy and Spain. These states frequently clashed with one another, and they all faced perennial challenges from within. Yet they organized their own territories efficiently, and they laid the foundations for the emergence of powerful national states in a later era. The Franks and the temporary revival of empire. Just a few decades after the Germanic general Otto of Saxony deposed the last of the Western Roman empires in 476 CE, the invaders organized a series of Germanic kingdoms as successor states in place of the Roman Empire. However, from the 5th through the 8th centuries, continuing invasions and conflicts among the invaders themselves left Western Europe in shambles. A major problem was that none of the Germanic people possessed the resources, much less the political and social organization to dominate all the others and establish their hegemony throughout Western Europe. Yet by the 9th century, one of these groups, the Franks, not only became one of the most powerful Germanic peoples, but also built an impressive imperial state that temporarily organized about half of the territories formerly embraced by the Western Roman Empire. Charlemagne. The Franks had won their dominance over other Germanic peoples as a result of strong military leadership, as well as the support of popes in Rome, who appreciated the Franks' conversion to Roman Christianity in the late 5th century. The Frankish realm reached its high point under the rule of the Carolingian family line during the reign of Charlemagne, Charles the Great, who ruled from 768 to 814. Charlemagne possessed enormous energy, and the building of the Carolingian Empire was in large measure his personal accomplishment. Although barely literate, Charlemagne was extremely intelligent. He spoke Latin, understood some Greek, and regularly conversed with theologians and other learned men. He also maintained diplomatic relations with the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate. When Charlemagne inherited the Frankish throne, his realm included most of modern France, as well as the lands that now form Belgium, the Netherlands, and southwestern Germany. By the time of his death in 814, Charlemagne had extended his authority to northeast Spain, Bavaria, northern Germany, and Italy as far south as Rome. Here's his map of his locations. Charlemagne's established administration. Charlemagne established a court and capital at Aachen in modern Germany, but he spent most of his reign traveling through his realm. To maintain authority in his absence, Charlemagne relied on aristocratic deputies known as counts, who held political, military, and judicial authority in local jurisdictions. However, because the counts often had their own political ambitions that were not the same as those of the central government, Charlemagne instituted a new group of imperial officials known as the Missi Domici, envoys of the Lord Ruler, who traveled annually to review the accounts of all local authorities. Charlemagne as emperor. Charlemagne worked extremely hard to keep his territories together. Although he had built the Frankish kingdom into an empire, he hesitated to call himself emperor because he knew the title would constitute a direct challenge to the Byzantine emperors who had inherited the Eastern Roman Empire. In 800, however, Charlemagne did accept the title when Pope Leo III publicly recognized his accomplishments by proclaiming him emperor during religious services on Christmas Day. Dissolution of Carolingian Empire. Yet Charlemagne's empire did not last long after his death. Indeed, both internally disunity and external invasions brought the Carolingian Empire to an early end. By 843, Charlemagne's three grandsons, who fought bitterly among themselves for the title of emperor, decided that they would solve the problem by dividing the country into three kingdoms. Even had the empire remained unified, however, it was already apparent that local counts in the emperor's vast realms were increasingly ignoring the central imperial government favor of their own interest. Moreover, Muslim invaders from the south, Hungarian Magyar invaders from the east, and Viking invaders from the north all contributed to massive instability in the region and helped to ensure the ultimate dissolution of the empire. The Holy Roman Empire, Otto the First. As the Carolingian Empire faded during the 9th century, local authorities took responsibility for providing in their own regions. Gradually, some of them extended their influence beyond their own jurisdiction and built larger states. Otto of Saxony was particularly aggressive. By the mid-10th century, he had established himself as king in northern Germany, and twice he ventured into Italy to quell political disturbances, protect the church, and seek opportunities in the south. In appreciation for his aid to the church, Pope John XII proclaimed Otto emperor in 962 CE. Thus was born the idea of the Holy Roman Empire. The imperial title had considerable cachet, and on several occasions, energetic emperors almost transformed the Holy Roman Empire into a hegemonic state that might have reintroduced imperial unity to Europe. Conflict with the papacy, however, prevented the emperors from building a strong and dynamic state. Although the popes crowned the medieval emperors, their relative relations were usually tense, since both popes and emperors made large claims to authority in Christian Europe. Relations became especially strained when emperors sought to influence the selection of church officials, which the popes regarded as their own prerogative, or when emperors sought to extend their authority into Italy, where the popes had long provided political leadership. Thus, when the popes felt threatened by the pretensions of the Holy Roman Empire, they entered into alliances with other European authorities to check the power of the emperors. Because of that, the Holy Roman Empire remained an empire principally in name. Voltaire, the 18th century French writer, once quipped that the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. Instead, it was a regional state that ruled Germany and occasionally sought to wield influence in Eastern Europe and Italy. Regional monarchies in France and England. In the absence of an effective imperial power, regional states emerged throughout medieval Europe. In France and England, princes established regional monarchies on the basis of relationships between lords and their retainers. Capitan France. The French monarchy grew slowly from humble beginnings. When the last Carolingians died in 987 CE, the lords of France elected a minor noble named Hugh Capet to serve as king. Capet only held a small territory around Paris, and some of his retainers were far more powerful than he. Over the next 3 centuries, however, his descendants, known as the Capetan kings, gradually added to their resources, expanded their political influence, and established the right to administer justice throughout the realm. By the early 14th century, the Capetan kings had gradually centralized power and authority in France. Here is the map, so that you can see how everything's divided. The Normans. The English monarchy developed quite differently. Its founders were Normans, descendants of Vikings who carved out a state on the peninsula of Normandy in France during the 9th century. Though nominally subject to the Carolingian and later to the Capetan rulers, the Dukes of Normandy in fact pursued their own interest with little regard for their lords. Within Normandy, the Dukes built a tightly centralized state in which all authority stemmed from the Dukes themselves. The Dukes also retained title to all land in Normandy and strictly limited the right of their retainers to grant land to others. In 1066, Duke William of Normandy invaded England, then ruled by descendants of the Angles, the Saxons, and other Germanic peoples. Following a speedy military victory, the Duke, now known as William the Conqueror, introduced Norman principles of government and land tenure to England and quickly established a tightly centralized realm. Both the Capetans and the Normans faced internal challenges from retainers seeking to pursue independent policies or enlarge their powers. Both dynasties also faced external challenges. Indeed, they often battled each other, since the Normans periodically sought to expand their possessions. Here's the Florence. In France, on the basis of the of relationships between lords and retainers. However, both the Capetans and the Normans managed to organize regional monarchies that maintained order and provided reasonably effective government. Regional states in Italy and Iberia. Italian states. Regional states emerged also in other lands of medieval Europe, though not on such a large scale as the monarchies of France and England. In Italy, for example, a series of I'm so sorry, guys. Ecclesiastical states, city-states, and principalities competed for power and position. By about the 12th century, a series of prosperous city-states, including Florence, Bologna, Genoa, Milan, and Venice, dominated not only their own urban districts, but also the surrounding hinterlands. Meanwhile, in southern Italy, Norman adventurers invaded territories still claimed by the Byzantine Empire and various Muslim states. With popular approval and support, they overcame Byzantine and Muslim authorities, brought southern Italy into the orbit of Roman Catholic Christianity, and laid the foundations for the emergence of the powerful kingdom of Naples. Christian and Muslim states in Iberia. As in Italy, a series of regional states competed for power in the Iberian Peninsula. From the 18th to the 11th century, Muslim conquerors ruled most of the peninsula, except for a few small states in southern Spain. Beginning in the mid-11th century, though, Christian adventurers from these states began to attack Muslim territories and enlarge their own domains. By the late 13th century. The Christian kingdoms of Castile, Aragon, and Portugal controlled most of the Iberian Peninsula, leaving only the small kingdom of Granada in Muslim hands. With its Holy Roman Empire, regional monarchies, ecclesiastical principalities, city-states, and new states founded on conquest, medieval Europe might seem to present a stark contrast to a centralized, reunified land such as China. Moreover, European rulers constantly campaigned to enlarge their holdings at the expense of their neighbors, and thus endlessly complicated medieval European politics. Yet the regional states of the Middle Ages effectively tended to public affairs in limited regions. In doing so, they fashioned alternatives to a centralized empire as a form of political organization, economic growth, and social development. As regional states provided increasingly effective political organization, regional lords and their vassals took charge of political and military affairs in a system of historians have commonly referred to as feudalism. The relative order and stability provided by feudalism eventually encouraged dramatic economic growth and social development in medieval Europe. The economic revival closely resembled the process that in an earlier era had strengthened China, India, and the Islamic world. Thus, even in the absence of centralized imperial authority, the increased agricultural production, urbanization, manufacturing, and trade spurred by feudalism transformed Europe and drew it once again into commercial relationships with distant lands. Here's the reverberations, should you wish to pause and read this. Organizing a decentralized society. When the short-lived Carolingian Empire dissolved, European nobles had little choice but to take responsibility for maintaining order in their own territories. Although most nobles owed nominal allegiance to a higher authority, in reality they acted with growing independence. They collected rents and fees, administered local affairs, mobilized armed forces, and decided legal disputes. Lords and retainers. To organize their territories, the local nobles built military and political relations. relationship with other prominent individuals in their territories. In doing so, they mobilized small private armies by attracting armed retainers into their service with grants of land or money. These grants enabled retainers to devote their energies to the service of their lords rather than the tasks of cultivating food for their families. Retainers became responsible for the organization of local public works projects, the resolution of disputes, and administration of justice. In exchange, retainers owed loyalty, obedience, and military service to their lords. As a result of these mutual obligations, lords and retainers merged into a hereditary noble class that lived off the surplus agricultural production it extracted from the cultivators. This decentralized political order developed into a complicated network of relationships between lords and retainers. Indeed, a lord with several retainers might himself be a retainer to a higher lord, who in turn might be one of several retainers to even greater lord, in a web of relationships extending from local communities to a king. Although this decentralized political order had the potential to lead to chaos if retainers decided to pursue their own interests. In several places, including England, Germany, and France, high-ranking lords built powerful states on such foundations. Serfs, manors, and the growth of agricultural economy. Serfs. The development of decentralized political order accompanied fundamental changes in European society. Among most of these changes was the creation during the mid-7th century of a new category of peasants called serfs. Serfs were not slaves subject to sale, but neither were they fully free. Instead, landlords allocated serfs to a certain portion of land to farm, and in exchange required both labor services as well as a portion of the serf's harvest. Male serfs typically worked 3 days a week in the fields of their lords and provided additional labor services during planting and harvesting seasons, while women churned butter, made cheese, brewed beer, spun thread, wove cloth, or sewed clothes for the lords and their families. Because landlords provided them with land to cultivate, and sometimes with tools and animals as well, serfs had little opportunity to move to different lands. Indeed, they were able to do so only with the permission of their lord. They even had to pay a fee for the right to marry a serf who worked for a different lord. Manors. During the early Middle Ages, the institution of serfdom encouraged the development of the manor as the principal form of agricultural organization in Western Europe. A manor was a large estate consisting of fields, meadows, forests, domestic animals, and serfs bound to the land. The lord of the manor was a prominent political or military figure who provided government administration and justice for the manor. In the absence of thriving cities, manors became largely self-sufficient communities. Lords of the manors maintained mills, bakeries, breweries, and wineries, and serfs produced most of the iron tools, leather goods, domestic utensils, and textiles that the manorial community needed. During the High Middle Ages, craft skills developed on manors would help fuel an impressive round economic development in Western Europe. New crops and tools. Peasant cultivators on manors also cleared forests, drained swamps, and increased the amount of land devoted to agriculture during the Middle Ages. As they did so, they also experimented with new agricultural techniques and implements. By the Middle Ages, European cultivators were experimenting with new crops and with different cycles of crop rotation to ensure the most abundant harvest without compromising the fertility of the soil. They increased cultivation, especially of beans, which not only provided dietary protein, but also enriched the land of their property of fixing nitrogen in the soils where they grow. In addition, European peoples expanded their use of water mills and heavy plows and introduced new tools like the horseshoe and horse collar, both of which increased the efficiency of agricultural labor. By the 13th century, observation and experimentation with new crops and new techniques had vastly increased understanding of agricultural affairs. News of these discoveries circulated widely throughout Europe in books and treatises on household economics and agricultural methods, which in turn led to increased agricultural productivity. Here's a picture of this, the manor house. Population growth, expansion of land under cultivation, improved methods of cultivation, and the use of new tools combined to increase both the quantity and the quality of food supplies. During the centuries from 1000 to 1300, European diets expanded from an almost complete reliance on grains to include meat, dairy products, fish, vegetables, and legumes, such as beans and peas. This increase in agricultural productivity supported rapid population growth. In 600 CE, as the Franks were beginning to gain dominance in Western Europe, the European population stood at about 26 million by 1000 when regional states had ended invasions and restored order. It had edged up to 36 million by 1300. Only 300 years later, the population had reached 79 million. Such rapid demographic growth in turn helped stimulate a vigorous revival of towns and trade in medieval Europe. The revival of towns and trade, urbanization. With the abundant supplies of food produced on manors during the Middle Ages by 1000 CE, European society was able to support large numbers of urban residents. Attracted by urban opportunities, people from the countryside flocked to established cities and founded new towns at strategically located sites. Cities founded during Roman times, such as Paris, London, and Toledo, became thriving centers of government and business, and new urban centers, such as Venice in northern Italy, also emerged. Northern Italy and Flanders, the northwestern part of modern Belgium, experienced especially strong urbanization. Thus, for the first time since the fall of the Western Roman Empire, cities began to play a major role in European economic and social development. Textile production. The growth of towns and cities brought about increasing specialization of labor, which in turn resulted in the dramatic expansion of manufacturing and trade. Manufacturing concentrated especially on the production of wool textiles. The cities of Italy and Flanders, in particular, became lively centers for the spinning, weaving, and dyeing of wool. Trade in wool products helped to fuel economic development throughout Europe. By the 12th century, the Counts of Champagne in northern France sponsored fairs that operated almost year-round and that served as vast marketplaces where merchants from all parts of Europe compared and exchanged goods. Mediterranean trade. The revival of urban society was most pronounced in Italy, which was geographically well situated to participate in the trade networks of the Mediterranean basin. During the 10th century, for example, the cities of Amalfi and Venice served as ports for merchants engaged in trade with Byzantine and Muslim partners in the eastern Mediterranean. Italian merchants exchanged salt, olive oil, wine, wool, fabrics, leather products, and glass for luxury goods such as gems, spices, silk, and other goods from India, Southeast Asia, and China that Muslim merchants brought to eastern Mediterranean markets. As trade expanded, Italian merchants established sizable communities in the major ports and commercial centers of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. And by the mid-13th century, some were even beginning to venture as far as Central Asia, India, and China in search of commercial opportunities. The Hanseatic League. Although medieval trade was most active in the Mediterranean basin, a lively commerce grew up also in the northern seas. The Baltic Sea and the North Seas were sites of a particularly well-developed trade network known as the Hanseatic League, or simply as the Hansa, an association of trading cities stretching from the Novgorod to London and embracing all the significant commercial centers of Northern Europe. The Rhine, the Danube, and other major European rivers linked the Hansa trade network with that of the Mediterranean. Here is the Genoese bankers. Improved business techniques. As in post-classical China and in the Islamic world, a rapidly increasing volume of trade encouraged the development of credit, banking, and new forms of business organization in Europe. Bankers issued, I'm so shaky today. Bankers issued letters of credits to merchants traveling distant markets, which could then be exchanged for merchandise or cash in their local currency. Meanwhile, merchants devised new ways of spreading and pooling the risks of commercial investments. They entered into partnerships with other merchants, and they limited the liability of partners to the extent of their individual investments. These arrangements encouraged the formation of commercial partnerships, thus further stimulating the European economy. The social exchange. The three estates. Medieval social commentators frequently held that European society embraced three estates or classes: those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. Those who prayed were clergy of the Roman Catholic Church, from the lowly parish priests to bishops, cardinals, and popes. The clergy constituted a spiritual estate owing its loyalty to the church rather than to secular rulers. The fighters came from the ranks of the nobles. They inherited their positions in society and received an education that concentrated on equestrian skills and military arts. Finally, there were those who worked, the vast majority of the population, who mostly cultivated land as peasants. The formula dividing society neatly into three classes captures some important truths about medieval Europe. It clearly reflects a society marked by political, social, and economic inequality. Although they did not necessarily lead lives of luxury, those who prayed and those who fought enjoyed rights and honors denied to those who worked. Though bound by secular law, for example, clerics were members of international spiritual society before they were subjects of a lord, and if they became involved in legal difficulties, they normally faced courts of law administered by the church rather than secular rulers. For their part, of the nobles mostly lived off of the surplus production of dependent peasants and serfs. Chivalry. Yet though expressing some truths, the formulas overlooked processes that brought considerable change to medieval European society. Within the ranks of the nobles, for example, an emphasis on chivalry and courtly behavior gradually introduced expectations of high ethical standards and refined manners that encouraged warriors to become cultivated leaders of society. Chivalry was an informal but widely recognized code of ethics and behavior. Considerable appropriate for nobles, church officials originally promoted the chivalric code in an effort to curb fighting within Christendom. By the 12th century, the ritual by which a young man became initiated into the nobility as a knight, commonly called for the candidate to place his sword on a church altar and pledge his service to God. Thus, the noble who observed the chivalric code would devote himself to the causes of order, piety, and the Christian faith over the long term. Then the code of chivalry helped to soften the manners of nobility. Here's sources from the past, should you wish to read this. This is privileges granted to the Hans of Cologne, 1157 to 1194. Independent cities. The model of 3 estates also did not account well for substantial minorities of people, including especially merchants and townspeople. Indeed, by the 12th century, the ranks of workers included not only peasants, but also increasing numbers of merchants, artisans, craft workers, and professionals who filled the growing towns of medieval Europe. Because of their military power, lords could dominate these growing towns and tax their wealth. As towns grew larger, however, urban populations were increasingly able to resist the demands of nobles and guide their own affairs. By the late 11th century, inhabitants of prosperous towns were demanding that local lords grant them charters of incorporation that exempted them from political regulation and allowed them to manage their own affairs. Sometimes groups of cities organized leagues to advance their commercial interests, as in the case of the Hanse, or to protect themselves against encroachments of political authorities. Guilds. Sorry, I thought I got lost for a second. Okay, here's the fish market. Guilds. The cities of medieval Europe were by no means egalitarian societies, yet medieval towns and cities also reflected the interest and contributions of the working classes. Merchants and workers in all the arts, crafts, and trades organized guilds that regulated the production and sale of goods within their jurisdictions. By the 13th century, the guilds had come to control much of the urban economy of medieval Europe. For example, guilds oversaw the teaching of the various trades, established standards of quality for manufactured goods, determined the prices at which members had to sell their products, and regulated the entry of new workers in their groups. Guilds had social as well as economic significance in that they provided a focus for friendship and mutual support in addition to work. Guild members regularly socialized with one another, and prosperous guilds often built large halls where the members held meetings, banquets, and sometimes boisterous drinking parties. Guilds often came to the aid of members and their families by providing financial and moral support for those who fell ill. They also arranged funeral services for their deceased and provided support for survivors. Thus, guilds constituted a kind of social infrastructure that made it possible for medieval cities to function. Urban women. Medieval towns and cities offered fresh opportunities for women as well as for men, although few routes to public authority were open to women. In the larger towns and cities, women worked alongside men as butchers, brewers, bakers, fishmongers, innkeepers, merchants, and occasionally physicians and pharmacists. Women dominated some occupations, particularly those involving textiles and decorative arts, such as sewing, spinning, weaving, and the making of hats, wigs, and fur garments. In addition, most guilds admitted women into their ranks, and some guilds had exclusively female memberships, despite the persistence of patriarchal social structures. The increasing prominence of women in Europe society illustrates the significance of towns and cities as agents of social change in medieval Europe. European Christianity during the Middle Ages. One of the most important developments of the early Middle Ages was the conversion of Western Europe to Roman Christianity. The Franks, the popes, and the monasteries played important roles in bringing about this conversion. The adoption of Roman Christianity ensured that medieval Europe would inherit crucial cultural elements from classical Roman society, including the Latin language and the institutional Roman Church. In addition, Roman Catholic Christianity guided European thought on religious, moral, and ethical matters. Representatives of the Roman Church administered the rituals associated with birth, marriage, and death. Most of the art, literature, and music of the Middle Ages drew inspiration from the Christian doctrines and stories, just as mosques and minarets defined the skylines of Muslim cities. The spires of churches and cathedrals dominated the landscape of medieval Europe, testifying visually to the importance of religion and the pervasive presence of the Roman Catholic Church. Western Christianity also changed in several ways during the late Middle Ages. As the Roman Catholic Church developed an identity distinct from the Eastern Orthodox Church, Western theologians became reacquainted with the works of Aristotle, mostly unknown to European scholars of the early Middle Ages, as they produced an impressive synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy of Christian values. Meanwhile, lay classes elaborated a rich tradition of popular religion that represented an effort to express Christianity in meaningful terms. The politics of conversion. Although Christianity was the principal source of religious, moral, and cultural authority in the Mediterranean basin, by the time the Roman Empire collapsed, Western Europeans did not demonstrate a deep commitment to Christianity until the Franks converted to the religion in the late 5th century. By the time of Charlemagne, the Carolingian Franks viewed themselves as protector of the Papacy and offered the popes both political and military support. Charlemagne also worked to spread Christianity in northern lands through both peaceful and military means. Between 772 and 804, for example, he waged a bitter campaign against Saxons, a pagan people inhabiting northern Germany. When he finally claimed victory, Charlemagne insisted not only that the Saxons acknowledged himself as their political lord, but that they replaced their pagan traditions with Christianity. Through campaigns such as this, as well as through diplomacy and the work of missionaries, by the year 1000 CE, Christianity had won the allegiance of most people throughout Western Europe and the Nordic lands. The Papacy. In addition to the support it received from the Franks, the Roman Church increased its authority in Europe through strong papal leadership when the Western Roman Empire collapsed. The Papacy survived and claimed spiritual authority over all the lands formally embraced by the empire. Initially, the popes cooperated closely with the Byzantine emperors, who, as leaders of the Eastern Roman Empire, seemed to be the natural heirs to Roman authority. Beginning in the late 6th century, however, the popes began increasingly to distinguish the Western Christian Church based in Rome from the Eastern Christian Church based in Constantinople by 1054 CE. The two churches differed so violently on so many issues that the Pope and the Patriarch of the Eastern Church excommunicated each other.
After the 11th century, the two branches of Christianity formed distinct identities as the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Church. Pope Gregory the First, the individual most important providing the Roman Church with its sense of identity and direction, was Pope Gregory the First, 590 to 604, also known as Gregory the Great. Most important, Gregory strengthened the Pope's control over church doctrine by reasserting papal primacy. The claim that the Bishop of Rome was the ultimate authority in the Christian Church, Gregory also enhanced the influence of the Roman Church in the lives of individuals by emphasizing the sacrament of penance, which required individuals to confess their sins to their priest and then to atone for their sins by the penitential acts prescribed by the priest. In addition, Gregory further strengthened the Roman Church by extending its appeal and winning new converts in Western Europe through the efforts of missionaries, and most of whom were monks. Indeed, Pope Gregory himself was a monk, and he relied heavily on the energies of his fellow monks in seeking converts throughout Europe. Monasticism. Christian monasticism had its origin in the 2nd century CE in Egypt, where devout Christians had formed communes to devote themselves to the pursuit of holiness. When Christianity became legal during the 4th century, the monastic lifestyle became an increasingly popular alternative throughout the Roman Empire. Saint Benedict and the Rule. During the early days of monasticism, each community developed its own rules, procedures, and priorities. Some communities demanded that their inhabitants follow extreme austere lifestyles that sapped the energy of the monks, whereas others did not establish any clear expectations of their recruits. In response to those haphazard conditions, St. Benedict of Nursia strengthened the early monastatic movement by providing it with the discipline and a sense of purpose. 529, St. Benedict prepared a set of regulations known as Benedict's Rule for the monastatic community that he had founded at Monte Cassino near Rome. The rule required monks to take vows to lead communal, celibate lives under the absolute direction of the abbot who supervised the monastery. Poverty, chastity, and obedience became the prime virtues for Benedictine monks. Through the influence of St. Benedict's sister, the nun St. Scholastica, 482 to 543, an adaptation of the rule soon provided guidance for the religious life of women living in convents. Within a century, most European monasteries and convents observed the Benedictine rule. Even today, most Roman Catholic monasteries observe rules that reflect the influence of the Benedictine tradition. Monasticism and society. Strengthened by the discipline that the Benedictine rule introduced, monasteries became a dominant feature in the social and cultural life of Western Europe. Throughout the Middle Ages, monasteries helped to provide order in the countryside. For example, and to expand agricultural production, monasteries accumulated large land holdings, as well as authority over serfs working their lands from the bequest of wealthy individuals, and on those lands, they mobilized both monks and serfs to clear forests, drain swamps, and prepare lands for cultivation. Indeed, monasteries organized much of the labor that brought about the expansion of agricultural production in early medieval Europe. Like Buddhist monasteries in Asian lands and charitable religious foundations in Muslim lands, European monasteries provided a variety of social services. They served as inns, places of refuge, orphanages, hospitals, and schools. Some monasteries maintained libraries and scriptoria where monks copied works of classical literature and philosophy as well as the scriptures and other Christian writings. Almost all the works of Latin literature that have come down to the present survive because of copies made by medieval monks. Finally, monasteries served as a source of literate, educated, and talented individuals whose secretarial and administrative services were crucial for the organization of effective government in early medieval Europe. Here's a picture of St. Francis. Dominicans and Franciscans. By the 12th century CE, however, many Benedictine monasteries had become so successful that monks residing within them led comfortable and leisurely lives instead of lives of poverty, chastity, and obedience. In response, some devout Christians responded to this state of affairs by organizing movements designed to champion spiritual over materialistic values. Most prominent of them was St. Dominic, 1170 to 1221, and St. Francis, 1182 to 1226. Sorry, this book keeps pushing back. During the 13th century, St. Dominic and St. Francis founded orders of mendicants, beggars, known as the Dominican and Franciscan friars, who would have no personal possessions and would have to beg for their food and other needs from audiences to whom they preached. Mendicants were especially active in towns and cities where they addressed throngs of recently arrived migrants whose numbers were so large that existing urban churches and clergy could not serve them well. The Dominicans and the Franciscans also worked zealously to combat heterodox movements and to persuade heretics to return to the Roman Catholic Church. Because of the various roles they played in the larger society, monasteries and mendicants were particularly effective agents in the spread of Christianity. Monasteries organized life in the countryside and provided social services, while monks and mendicants zealously preached Christianity and tended to the spiritual needs of rural populations. As a result of their efforts over the decades, the centuries, monks and the mendicants helped to instill Christian values in countless generations of European peasants. Universities and Scholastic Theology. Cathedral schools. By the High Middle Ages, Europe's increasing wealth and social complexity created a strong demand for educated individuals who could deal with the complicated political, legal, and theological issues. In response to such demand, by the 11th century, bishops and archbishops in France and northern Italy organized schools in their cathedrals and invited well-known scholars to serve as master teachers. By the 12th century, the cathedral schools had established formal curricula, instruction concentrated on the liberal arts, especially literature and philosophy. Students read the Bible and the writings of the church fathers, as well as classical Latin literature and the few works of Plato and Aristotle that were available in Latin translation. Some cathedral schools also offered advanced instruction in law, medicine, and theology. Universities. About the mid-12th century, students and teachers organized academic guilds and persuaded political authorities to grant charters guaranteeing their rights. Student guilds demanded rigorous, high-quality instruction from their teachers, while the faculty sought to vest
teachers with the right to bestow academic degrees and to control the curriculum in their own institutions. Here's the Notre Dame Cathedral. These guilds had the effect of transforming cathedral schools into university. By the late 13th century, universities had appeared in cities throughout Europe. Scholasticism. St. Thomas Aquinas. The evolution of the university coincided with the rediscovery of the works of Aristotle, which European scholars learned about through increased contacts with the Byzantine as well as Muslim philosophers. During the 13th century, Latin translations of Aristotle's works spread throughout Europe, and they profoundly influenced almost all branches of thought. The most notable result was the emergence of Scholastic Theology, which sought to synthesize the beliefs and values of Christianity with the logical rigor of Greek philosophy. The most famous of the Scholastic theologians was St. Thomas Aquinas, 1225 to 1274, who spent most of his career teaching at the University of Paris. While holding fervently to his Christian convictions, St. Thomas believed that Aristotle had understood and explained the workings of the world better than any other thinker. St. Thomas saw no contradictions between Aristotle and Christian revelation. In this view, Aristotle explained the world according to human reason, while Christianity explained it as part of a divine plan. Thus, Scholastic theology represented the synthesis of reason and faith. Like the Neo-Confucianism of the Chapt or the Islamic philosophy of the Ibn Rushd, Scholastic theology reinterpreted inherited beliefs in light of the most advanced knowledge of the time. Popular religion. St. Thomas and other scholastic theologians addressed a sophisticated intellectual elite rather than the common people of medieval Europe. The popular masses neither knew nor cared about Aristotle. For the purposes, Christianity was important primarily as a set of beliefs, ceremonies, and rituals that gave meaning to individual lives that bound them together into coherent communities. Here is thinking about traditions. Sacraments. Popular piety generally entailed observance of the sacraments and devotion to the saints recognized by the Roman Catholic Church. Sacraments are holy rituals that bring spiritual blessings on the observance. The Church recognized 7 sacraments, including baptism, matrimony, penance, and the Eucharist. By far, the most popular was the Eucharist. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce that word. Eucharist. I tried to pronounce these prior to. Sorry, guys. By far, the most popular was the Eucharist, during which priests offered a ritual meal commemorating Jesus' last meal with his disciples before his trial and execution by Roman authorities. Because the sacrament kept individuals in good standings with the Church, conscientious believers observed it weekly, and they especially devote on a daily basis. Popular beliefs held that the sacrament would protect individuals from sudden death and advance their worldly interests. Devotion to saints. Popular religion also took the form of devotion to the saints. According to the Church teaching, saints were human beings who had led such exemplary lives that God held them in special esteem. As a result, they enjoyed special influence with heavenly authorities and were able to intervene on behalf of individuals living in the world. Medieval Europeans frequently invoked the aid of saints who had reputations for helping living people as well as souls of the dead. Tradition held that certain saints could cure diseases, relieve toothaches, and guide sailors through storms.
to a port. The Virgin Mary. During the High Middle Ages, the most popular saint was always the Virgin Mary, Mother of Jesus, who personified the Christian ideal of womanhood, love, and sympathy, and who reportedly lavished aid on her devotees. During the 12th and 13th centuries, Europeans dedicated hundreds of churches and cathedrals to the Virgin, among them of the splendid Cathedral of Notre Dame, Our Lady of Paris. Saint relics. Medieval Europeans went to great lengths to express their adoration of the Virgin and other saints through the variation of their relics and physical remains. Widely believed to retain the powers associated with the holy individuals themselves, churches assembled vast collections of relics such as clothes, locks of hair, teeth, bones, and famous saints. Especially esteemed were relics associated with Jesus or the Virgin, such as the crown of thorns that Jesus reportedly wore during his crucifixion, or drops of the Virgin's milk miraculously preserved in a vial. Pilgrimage. Some collections of relics became famous well beyond their own regions. Like Muslims making the Hajj, pilgrims trekked long distances to honor the saints the relics represented. The making of the pilgrimage became so common during the High Middle Ages that a travel industry emerged to serve the needs of pilgrims. Inns dotted the routes leading to popular churches and shrines, and guides shepherded groups of pilgrims to religious sites and explained their significance. There were even guidebooks that pointed out the major attractions along pilgrims' routes and warned them of difficult terrain, of unscrupulous scoundrels who took advantage of visitors. This is the continued works for the primary source, Coronation of Charlemagne by Pope Leo III, 800. Pope Leo reigned from 795 to 816, had very little authority outside of Rome, and even within Rome he had enemies. In search of a protector, he found King Charles or Charlemagne. Charles mounted a military campaign that destroyed a rival of the Pope and the Lombard, who had threatened the city of Rome. Leo had already spent a lot of money beautifying Rome. One of his more ambitious projects was adding 2 massive reception halls to his residence known as the Lateran Palace. In the fashion of its day, there were many mosaics, many of them in particular. Next page is the primary source for your RP. Any significance about the 3 figures are arranged. 2. What do you make of the fact that it is Peter who gave Charles the lance and not Jesus? 3. What is the message of this mosaic? Contrast it with the mosaic of the Justinian. The next page. Blessed Peter, you give life to the Pope Leo, and you give victory to King Charles. Here's the Justinians. This is the end of chapter 16 for World History 2. I'm so sorry, guys.